The content of this presentation is structured in 5 parts. After the introduction, research questions, and the hypotheses, I will provide a short overview over the module's nature and human nature, and the role of information. The modules for body, mind, and soul, as well as the consciousness module responsible for measurements on the reality construct, can only be touched briefly due to time constraints. In the third block, I will describe the path for optimal development of a concept or the sustainable solution of a problem. The forces influencing our decision-making are described, as well as the influence of addictions to reality constructs. The result of the pseudomorph cognitive map are the 117 pure fiducial states, plus the 3 axes of the optimal coordinate system. In the last chapter, I will summarize our findings and discuss the results. Let's start from the beginning. This is an image showing the human connectome and how different physical parts of the brain are connected with each other. This helps scientists to understand how information travels in the brain and which areas are related to each other to execute certain functions. If we want to identify anomalies in cellular structures and processes, we can take a 3-dimensional fMRI scan and slice it into 2D images. Wouldn't it be nice to do the same not only with the body, but mind and soul as well? Or even better, all at the same time? Perhaps we can. There is a mathematical analog to a tomographic slice called geometric lattices. The E8 lattice is a model of all elementary particle interactions. Since it describes all possible interactions, it also describes all possible errors that can occur in decision-making processes. The designation E8 comes from the Kochen-Killing classification of the complex simple Lie algebras, which fall into 4 infinite series labeled AN, BN, CN, DN, and 5 exceptional cases labeled E6, E7, E8, F4, and G2. The E8 algebra is the largest and most complicated of these exceptional cases, and since it has a root system, it is perfectly suited to model human information processes. The E8 lattice in 8 dimensions and the Leech lattice in 24 dimensions are remarkable in that they give optimal solutions to the sphere packing problem and the kissing number problem. The sphere packing problem relates to wisdom, and the kissing number problem relates to conductivity or successful information transport. The better information can be transported within or between people, the better the performance. However, the pseudomorph model is not only based on the complex simple Lie algebras from quantum set theory, but also on the Hopf algebras, quantum groups, and topological field theory. The phase transitions across the pure states relate to the Potts model. This wood carving by an unknown artist is often depicted to illustrate a medieval worldview or reality construct beyond 3-dimensional space. While we can at least potentially see everything in 3D space, there is an invisible reality hidden in higher dimensional spaces. The purpose of this presentation is to illuminate the hidden variables in this space between the spaces. In statistical mechanics, the Potts model, a generalization of the Ising model, is a model of interacting spins on a crystalline lattice. Generalizations of the Potts model have also been used to model grain growth in metals and coarsening in foams. A further generalization of these methods, known as the cellular Potts model, has been used to simulate static and kinetic phenomena in foam and biological morphogenesis. The pseudomorph model maps humans to spinners to describe morphogenesis. If we take the 117 SIC-POVMs of identities with 0 eigenvalue and add the 3 coordinate axes from 3D space, we arrive at the 120 ecosians. The different dimensional annotations can be confusing, so the structure of this presentation follows the development from an unconscious identity to a conscious identity over the Kochen-Specker graph to the E8 lattice, the reality construct or worldview as holographic sphere, and finally the amplituhedron. Pseudomorph shows how particle interactions can be mapped to conceptual spaces that inform our psychosocial interactions. In other words, the 117 points of the original Kochen-Specker theorem are the minimal amount of conceptual spaces necessary to measure total consciousness. The research questions that guided this work were: first, what is the minimal amount of concurrent concepts or pure consciousness states for best decision making? Second, what is the coordinate system for best decision making? And third, what is the relationship between identity, performance, and psychopathology? The two hypotheses were: first, there is a relationship between decision-making, happiness, identity, space, and time that relates to the 120 equations and the Kochen-Specker theorem. And second, people are sustainably happy when they can be certain that objective reality and their perception of reality are the same, and when they are more effective in solving problems than in creating new ones. The core problem we need to understand is the measurement problem. The measurement problem in quantum mechanics is the problem of how or whether wave function collapse occurs. Framed differently, when we measure or observe other people to determine who is ahead and who is behind, in our case wisdom, we can never be completely sure in a loop because we and the other person are constantly changing. Truthfulness of measurement depends on the frame of reference. This means that everything is true and false at the same time, depending on the perspective we choose to look at the problem. Too much information leads to misunderstandings, and too little information leads to false assumptions. This means that all if questions are useless, because if something is or is not depends on the conditions of its occurrence and cannot be stated absolutely. This is the entry point of relativity, where the same thing can look very different depending on time and context. Applied to human communication, the problem looks like this, and relates to the Heisenberg uncertainty, which states that the better we can measure another person's location, the less we can be certain about the velocity or speed of change, and vice versa. This fact of nature should make us very humble in judging other people and ourselves. In the end, we can never be fully certain with one measurement alone. However, when we ask the right questions, we need a maximum of 3 interactions to establish certainty. The 3 interactions relate to measurements along the 3 coordinate axes, which will be shown at the end of this presentation. In communication between a sender and a receiver, there are 7 possible areas where errors can happen. Errors are basically information lost in translation, either internally or externally. Either there is an error in what I meant or what I said, or what you heard or what you understood. Either what I say is wrong, how I say it, or why I say it. This translates to 4 generalized errors that can be related to Feynman diagrams in particle physics and logic. Either I am wrong, you are wrong, we are both right, or we are both wrong. To make matters worse, sometimes we are even communicating over a noisy channel and we have to cancel out background noise. Background noise can be roughly translated with bias. Unfortunately, if we dig a little deeper, the problem looks more like this illustration. If we map the information transport problem from psychosocial frameworks to mathematical frameworks, we need to look at the sphere packing problem for communication and the kissing number problem for interaction. Without going into details, these 2 problems relate not only to optimal information transformation and maximal certainty in communication, but they also reveal our reality construct and therefore our worldview. Despite noise and errors in communication, there are methods to analyze psychosocial interactions to identify deeply rooted cognition errors that relate to Fourier transformations and the Born rule in probability theory. In short, the more certain we are about information, the better our decisions, the better our solutions, and the happier we can potentially be. Some of the illustrations in this presentation contain more information that can be presented legibly. However, if you would like to inspect them more closely, all of the high-density illustrations can be downloaded directly from the website pseudomorph.eu. This illustration provides an overview of the pseudomorph modules involved in interaction processes between an identity and nature mediated by reality constructs. It illustrates the components necessary for conscious information processing, or more specifically, in pure fiducial state distillation. The components that are normally embedded in each other are spread out, so the process of transforming information to energy and matter can be tracked more easily. On the far left-hand side, we have the symbol for nature, the cube, and the human identity symbolized by the triangle, which stands for the tetrahedron. The triangle can be either unoriented, like in a random walk, which is simply the mathematical term for curiosity, or oriented to make purposeful or goal-directed movements in morphospace. Let's look at the processes within the different modules. When information enters module 1, or the identity matrix, it is quantized or decoded and results in a gradient that is sent to module 3 for modulation. After choosing one of 4 possible pathways, information is then projected to module 2, or configuration space. The resulting projection can then be measured either spatially in module 4.1 or temporally in module 4.2. Depending on the outcome of the measurement, the result is then fed back into module 1. Module 5 is not really an additional fundamental module, but provides more detailed description about the optimal path of concept development in a creative problem-solving process and reasons for wrong measurements related to tensions caused by temperature and pressure, or in the worst case, addictions to reality constructs. The bottom row simply shows the different consciousness states of being, as well as the states of becoming on its way through morphospace. The pseudomorph standard model of consciousness lists the 96 covariant SIC-POVMs translated to psychosocial phenomena. The SIC in dimension 2, the Hesse-SIC in dimension 3, and the set of Hoggar lines in dimension 8 are the only 3 SICs up to unitarity equivalence whose symmetry groups act transitively on pairs of SIC projectors. This does not only provide valuable insight about SICs, Heisenberg-Weil groups, and Clifford groups, but also offers a new approach and perspective for studying many other discrete symmetric structures behind finite state quantum mechanics, such as mutually unbiased bases called MUPs and discrete Wigner functions. Although my personal knowledge in these fields is too limited to explain them in detail. What is the potential of identity in processing information? The potential of information processing can be compared to a light beam that passes through a prism and is then projected onto a sphere. In the ideal case, the prism is solid or integrated and yields a homogeneous spectrum between minimal and maximum bending of the light rays. This allows us to separate distorted information or background noise from purposeful information with minimal distortions. You can imagine what happens to the diffraction pattern when you imagine that prism being smashed to the ground and then glued together again. We will look at this special case again in Module 5. For now, we are only concerned with 2 possible outcomes of the refraction. When the different colors are reunited again, the result is shown in the lower right corner of the illustration and can be either white or black or anything in between. This relates to possible 3-valued logical outcomes of true, false, or indeterminate, or a 4-valued logic like true, false, both, or none. Let's talk about the non-physical aspects of identity from a psychological perspective and how they can be mapped to physical objects. The id can be related to kinematic energy, the superego to potential energy, and the ego relates to the eigenvalue that we add to our identity when making decisions. While the superego is observing and measuring the physical parts of the universe, the abstract ego, termed by Jung, resembles the observer, which looks at the ego and measures its performance from within, although it is illustrated here as observer from above. The right-hand side shows the interpretations of the human identity related to Freud, Jung, and Buckminster Fuller. After we have looked at the form of identity, we now turn our attention to the actual information content that is being processed and how pure quantum states can be derived from it. As mentioned before, the prerequisite for purposeful action or fully informed decision-making is purposeful information. Purposeful information comes in three similar but distinct manifestations. When the smallest information particles are clustered in a purposeful pattern, we get knowledge or an experience in form of a SIC, a symmetrical information complete molecule. It contains the three parts labeled what, how, and why as the most abstract form of information. This general information is specialized or localized into the smallest purposeful condition. This also contains three parts, namely the who, the where, and the when something is or is not. If those two are combined, they yield the smallest purposeful perception or SIC-POVM measurement. This relates to wisdom and can be compared to electrification of otherwise dead material. The electrification happens through interaction, cognition, or simply thinking, feeling, and acting. Projected to a 3D space, we can see the two mutually unbiased bases and the SIC-POVMs taken from one of the vertices of the cube. So how does consciousness build frameworks or topological spaces that are later assembled into a full reality construct? When information enters our consciousness, it is quantized and evaluated. First, the information is valued as right or wrong. Then it is valued according to whether the information elicits hope or despair. Since we are only interested in the pure states, we will not talk about the in-between states. When the two measurement axes are superimposed on each other and their ends glued together in the back, they form a Möbius band as depicted on the right-hand side. One Möbius band can be compared to the edge of one plane in Euclidean space. Three bands or three planes form the total Euclidean space. This process is illustrated in the second row from a graph theoretical perspective and the formation of minimal purposeful structures on which we can base our decisions on. The process of decision-making thus reduces to the simple task of counting dots on a plane. The more dots on a plane, the more complete information we have and the better our decisions are. The cool thing about consciousness is that it has an autocomplete function. This means that the two loops of maximum information that form a plane are compared to each other and the loop with the most dots wins. This feature makes it possible to make decisions even if we do not have complete information or if there are dots missing on the plane. Now we have covered the basics, let's turn to the inside structures of the modules. Module 1 is the main default network or the monster group in group theory, which also contains the baby monster, Module 3, and the Fisher-24 group, Module 2. The horizontal and vertical slices represent the possible spatial and temporal measurements. The result of this matrix, depicted in dimension 10, is certainty. Certainty is the product of sympathy and empathy. This does not come as a big surprise, since successful information transformation is greatly enhanced if there are values for sympathy for myself and the other person, as well as empathy for myself and the other person. This relates to relaxed conditions for measurement. This is the context for optimal information transfer that results in certainty of either a black or a white dot. Black meaning certain, white meaning uncertain. Since absolute certainty is seldom accomplished in reality, a more realistic picture is a gradient of shades of gray between black and white extremes. Remember that we are interested in finding the possible, the probable, and the actual errors that we can make and how they are related. So the space of possible errors lies between what we do, how we do it, and why we do what we do. However, since we're not only responsible for what we do, but also for what we don't do but could have done, the actual space of errors is between the possible errors and the probable errors. If we add contextuality to the picture, we get a 3x3 matrix. Since we're only concerned with the positive operator valued measurements, we can simply assume a double of the depicted matrix as shadow plane, illustrating all measurements as not. The inside elements of the matrix resemble the 27 dimensions of Jordan algebra that form the 33 Paris rays from the Kochen-Specker theorem, together with the 6 outside elements. The 18 categories from the gray boxes belong to the 96 covariant SIC-POVMs illustrated in the Pseudomorph standard model of consciousness. The colors used in this illustration resemble the colors used in quantum chromodynamics. As mentioned before, if the text is not readable, you can download the illustrations from the website. Module 2 resembles the Centon network or our mind. It is an illustration of the 48 Paris rays related to the Kochen-Specker theorem. The green and red lines represent configurations for either optimal conductance or insulation. This can be compared to information that we experience either attractive or repelling. Module 2 also represents the fundamental problem of distinguishing categories in boundaries accurately due to their relativistic nature. Module 3 is the chief executive network or our soul. It consists of 12 vertices that resemble physical and 6 unphysical components that represent the power set and cannot be created or manipulated directly. The physical components lie on the diagonal lines, whereas the unphysical components lie on the vertical line, the so-called ghosts. This module resembles the upper and lower half of the Higgs field and determines how we deal with errors. When we are involved in decision-making and problem-solving, sooner or later we run into errors. The 4 possible options to deal with an error are either we don't do anything and try to conserve what we have. Conservation, unfortunately, leads to deterioration and finally expiration. The next better thing compared to doing nothing is to blame somebody for the error that occurred. This resembles a need for admiration, since we expect to be praised for having identified the cause of the error, while at the same time having preserved our internal integrity. Unfortunately, sooner or later, it will be discovered that not only somebody outside of ourselves is responsible for the error, but that also we ourselves contributed to the happening of an error. Remember from Module 1, we are not only responsible for what we do, but also for what we don't do but could have done. Since we are all connected, nothing can happen without us letting it happen. So we have always a responsibility, whether we are directly involved or not. The next best thing from blaming others for an error is to blame ourselves and to ask for forgiveness. Asking for forgiveness leads to reconciliation and redemption from the problem. The best case of dealing with an error is to get an inspiration that leads to creativity and finally to innovation. This is the optimal path of sustainable problem solving. Since the model correlates inside and outside measurements, everything I said about the different paths relate to outside as well as inside. This means blame can either happen towards myself or to another person, as well as forgiveness can be applied to self or others. Regarding the other two options, there is not that much we can do. Our experience of being human is necessarily subject to natural deterioration, and we will die eventually. The only way to circumvent this process is by continuous self-actualization and innovation to become better versions of ourselves despite physical deterioration. The relationship of the soul to black holes and white holes is simple. When we absorb information and radiate purposeful information, we behave like a black hole, and if we emit only hot gas, we behave like a white hole. So, while it was good to have a white hole at the beginning of the universe, black holes are needed to create purpose. The upper and lower half can be compared to a membrane being either open, closed, or in a fluctuating gyroidal state. If we combine module 2 and 3, we get the Pauli matrices or the Hopf vibration, depending on your frame of reference. The Posner molecule in biology is associated with consciousness and resembles the combined structure of the lattice as the 33 Paris rays in the proof of the Kochen-Specker theorem. Now we come to the measurement apparatus. Module 4.1 represents the 11th dimension in M-theory and represents the spatial orientation of our identity tetrahedron. The two directions of this one-dimensional space also represent the conditions for conductivity as well as insulation. If our reality construct is oriented toward truth, beauty, and harmony, we have optimal integration and balance of information. If our reality construct is built on lie, ugliness, and unharmony, we have optimal fragmentation and disbalance of information. This measurement relates to harmonic oscillators or cellular automata in artificial intelligence. Mathematically, it is a measurement of the information density of the torus, or the angle relative to the surface. The two directions relate to creation and annihilation operators and relate to our capacity of imagination. While module 4.2, which comes next, is busy identifying points on a plane, this module draws lines around clustered points to form a group. Module 4.2 represents the 12th dimension in F-theory or dimension 26 in string theories, and it represents the temporal measurement. This module works like gauge fixing and splits the Möbius band into three sections: past, present, and future. Since we can only focus on either categories or boundaries, this module either utilizes the middle section for linear phenomena in D10 or the outside sections in nonlinear measurements of dimension 12. It can be compared to the observer looking at the self. While module 4.1 represents the superego, this module represents the abstract ego in Jungian terms. The function of this module is to perform measurements within or between tori like time slices that are stacked on each other to produce a flow of time. This is similar to a movie that is comprised of individual still images. Cognition is often considered a black box, but once inside, it is illuminated beautifully like a pinball machine, where everything is connected and information bounces around between the various operators that are getting triggered by the magnetic ball. In short, every time the ball interacts with its environment, it receives new information that determines a new path for the ball to roll. This leads to the next question: how can the pathways be calculated? Nash equilibrium is a concept within game theory where the optimal outcome of a game is where there is no incentive to deviate from their initial strategy. It relates to the famous prisoner's dilemma and can be mapped to human behavior when we deviate from our beliefs, or, in other words, when we contradict our own belief system created by our understanding of our identity. Based on our knowledge of who we are and where we are coming from, we produce trajectories or belief about where we will be going in the future. Based on our beliefs, we attempt to predict the future. Now, if we experience surprises or make an error, we can know that either our belief systems were wrong or we didn't act in accordance with our beliefs. Religion uses the term sin to describe belief errors, which roughly means missing the mark. Belief can be translated to energy. Since we are naturally free to believe whatever we want, we can also call it free energy. Belief relates to the invisible world, since the future cannot be seen. It provides us with energy even in situations when we do not see or know anything. The more we deviate from this source of energy, the harder life gets due to less energy we can utilize. The optimal path is therefore when our knowledge, our beliefs, and our interactions are aligned with each other, and therefore with our identity. The more we distrust ourselves or deny our true identity, the more we diverge from this optimal path up to psychopathology, or more specifically, bore out or burn out. Divergence is usually accompanied with guilt, shame, pride, and prejudice, and can be mathematically expressed as Kullback-Leibler divergence. To make this phenomenon more specific, imagine yourself as a ball attached to a spring. When new information hits the ball is kicked forward. Depending on the angle of impact, the ball swings forward and the path could be easily calculated. Unfortunately, hopes and fears create mass, which relates to the magnetic fields for attraction or repulsion, which also influence the movement path and hence create space-time curvature. The optimal path as well as the distorted path are illustrated on the right-hand side of the slide and relate to phylotactical morphogenesis or movements on reality constructs. Reality construct is just a geometrical term for a belief system in our context. The pathways can be calculated by looking at the forces that act on the ball. From a connectivity perspective, there is a recent study published by Nature that identified 4 biomarkers that are responsible for all psychopathologies. The biomarkers are fear, mood, psychosis, and externalizing behavior, and they can be mapped to the physical forces of electromagnetism, strong and weak nuclear force, and gravity. This means that psychopathologies are not manifestations of mere local influences, but they are connected globally through the same functions. These 4 biomarkers correspond to off-shell spaces on the diagonals of the Pseudomorph model, the transition space where people can get lost or stuck. It is like a toxic space we should not dwell in for too long. Since the Pseudomorph model is interested in information flow, conductance and valence bands, this finding is crucial for a new understanding of psychology and psychopathology and can be compared to being ahead or behind spacetime relative to an individual's frame of reference and reality construct. If we are behind spacetime, this means that there is too little purposeful information in our reality construct, and if we are ahead, there is too much purposeful information. Too much information leads to misunderstandings. Too little information leads to false assumptions. First, we looked at the observable behavior outside. Now we look inside the ball to check what happens in the usually invisible area. When new information enters the human system, it causes a thinking and a feeling response. Apparently, the feeling process is faster than the thinking process, as the Libet experiment showed, but this does not make a difference in this context, since we are interested in the pure states when thinking and feeling are combined optimally. The result is normally one of 4 states as shown on the left-hand side. The extreme cases, when we lose touch with reality, are shown on the right-hand side and reflect the biomarkers for psychopathology mentioned on the last slide. If we think something is wrong and we experience despair, we sell out. If we think something is wrong, but we have hope that we can change it, we disengage. and even externalize our aggression in the extreme case. This logic continues to a state of compliance and then the buy-in state, and even entails the vector equilibrium state in the middle, which relates to the fake vacuum field in physics. Let's look at the issue of too much and too little information in the absolute extreme cases of consciousness at the boundaries between life and death first, and then between the relative extreme cases between genius and crazy, or framed differently, between super performance and psychopathology. The absolute end of human consciousness is death. This can either happen when we kill or when we get killed. Within these absolute boundaries, we can do pretty much whatever we want. For example, if we have too much love for ourselves, we get killed by our own unhealthy lifestyle. If we have too little love for others, we don't have a problem killing others. If we have too much love for others, we might get killed and die as a martyr. In the worst case, we have too much and too little love for ourselves at the same time, which leads to suicide. Now I will talk about the relative extreme cases where nobody is getting killed, but our body does funny things when subjected to tension. This slide shows the forces acting on the identity inside as well as the result on the outside when one-sided tension is exerted on a muscle or operator for too short or too long. Left rotation is too short and right rotation means too long. The left side illustration shows the force field when we make a decision. We make decisions in the space between who we would like to be and who we would like to become, and who we don't like to be and who we don't like to become. If all forces exhibit the same strength, we are in vector equilibrium, at rest, or experience inner and outer peace. There are four possible forces that act on our identity to change, as depicted on the right-hand side illustration. The motivations are I must change versus I may change along one diagonal, and I am able to change and I am willing to change on the other diagonal. Ideally, we have data points for all those forces, which enable us to be ready for change in all possible directions. The state of presence is the precondition for optimal information transfer in the center of the matrix where two spheres are kissing. The knot areas outside of the inner space relate to the absence of a vital force. The result is loss of touch with our own reality construct because counterbalancing forces are missing due to lack of information. When we look at the muscle states, or the corners of the square, we can identify four states. Relaxed on the upper left corner, which moves to the right corner when tension is exerted. If contraction lasts for too long, the muscle braces and rotates to the lower right corner. If pressure continues, the muscle eventually ruptures and moves to the injured state and continues then to the protective stance state, where we eventually reach a state of habituation. Connections become stronger to the point where we act automatically without even thinking. This is basically the autopilot mode. Habituation or complacency, however, can also lead to injury. The saying goes, use it or lose it, which means that if we don't move our muscles enough, they deteriorate in our body, and our body attempts to conserve energy by stiffening the joints, so they need less energy. Unfortunately, this process also leads to a reduction in flexibility. Strictly speaking, this means that all humans show pathological behavior all the time. Clinical diagnosis is only a matter of frequency and intensity of symptoms. It is absolutely normal to experience fear, be moody, or be aggressive sometimes. And even psychosis is totally natural considering the holographic principle. Who would not freak out at the prospect of life being a reality simulation and we are if stripped from self-created ego enclosures, are but a tetrahedral agent in hyperspace. When we translate information to performance and finally happiness about our own performance, 7 optimal pure states can be identified that resemble increasing amounts of consciousness. The shaded areas represent addictions that prohibit change of the reality construct. Pathological symptoms are the result of gaps and contradictions in reality constructs. There are also 7 additional steps along the other diagonal, but since they are not on the optimal path, they are not considered here. What does that mean? Well, mood, for example, is caused by addiction to others' reality construct or addiction to connectivity with others. Psychosis is caused by addiction to own and others' reality constructs at the same time. This leads to an inability to differentiate noise from purposeful information, caused by a fragmented and disbalanced identity at the core. Externalizing behavior is caused by an addiction to one's own reality construct. This can be seen in narcissistic behavior, where other opinions do not count and a person is convinced of his or her own superiority. Fear is caused by an addiction to a reality construct outside of the current reality. Since the extinction of the saber-tooth, humanity has no real danger outside of itself. Comparing suicide rates with the death tolls from terror attacks, for example, amplifies the fact that the true enemy is inside ourselves, not outside. These 7 steps can also be related to the 7 commands of a Turing machine. Next to the pure consciousness states, the Pseudomorph model also provides the optimal coordinate system as the measurement axis for body, mind, and soul. This is hopefully the answer to Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness. According to Pseudomorph, consciousness defines the relationship between identity, performance, and pathology. It is the built-in coordinate system, the core wisdom, the root cause of the finite and infinite reference frame for orientation and navigation in hyperspace, especially for the fine-tuning of the conceptual spaces in decision-making and problem-solving processes. The tipping point in human development is the moment when we take responsibility for the conscious experience of being and becoming fully human on this planet. Responsibility means that we are not only responsible for what we do, but also for what we don't do but could have done. Accountability of our body means autonomy, safety, and certainty. Ownership of our mind means truth, beauty, and harmony. And responsibility for our soul means love, peace, and happiness. We have reached now the results section of our work. Pseudomorph illustrates the psychosocial relationship between decision-making, identity, space, and time. The conceptual spaces were related to the 120 ecosians, which can be broken down to the 117 SIC-POVMs as the minimum pure consciousness states and the 3-dimensional coordinate axes for best decision-making. In contrast, the E8 lattice has in addition the 120 not categories that are not used in the Pseudomorph model. The transition phases can be explained with the POTS model. Transformation from information to energy and matter relate to gaseous, liquid, and solid states in spin glass systems and superconductivity. The purpose of the human identity is learning, growth, and transformation, or simply information processing. If there is too much or too little information flow in reality constructs, caused by pressure or temperature, pathologies or anomalies emerge. Gaps and contradictions in reality construct distort information flow to the point of psychopathologies that are also noticeably outside. The level of consciousness can be measured by adding and multiplying observable concepts. Triangulation on the SICs can therefore be used to ask better questions or to make invisible observables visible. The higher the level of consciousness, the more sustainable a solution is. Sustainable happiness is therefore the single best KPI for measuring effective problem-solving capabilities. So, what's new in the Pseudomorph model? Well, the Pseudomorph model itself presents no new scientific information. The novelty of the model lies only in the dressing of the reality construct with a psychosocial topological skin to design a cognitive map, so measurements can be performed more effectively without the measurement error. Although the labels match nicely the theories behind, a structured semantical analysis on the categories used in the model would need to be performed to actually show whether they are from the same frameworks or perhaps slightly off, and better labels should be used to model a natural language more precisely.